So like, let's say we make multiple assumptions. Bitcoin's very successful. Bitcoin becomes very widespread. Bitcoin becomes more private due to various layers and things like that that can do that. Then that presents a challenge to the government because it makes it harder to generate income from seigniorage, and it also makes trouble, determining what people's income is or what their wealth is and things like that.
In an interview with Simply Bitcoin, macro analyst Lynn Alden broke down why the government doesn't want Bitcoin to become widely adopted and how Bitcoin can disrupt the power structure. Alden explained that because the current system has no transparency, governments can run at a deficit without most understanding what's going on, print the difference, and leave us footing the bill via taxes. This lack of transparency and broadening of the currency clearly devalues the savings of the general population on a year-to-year basis, but Alden argues it's deeper than that. Alden believes if there was more transparency in the monetary system, wars would happen less, the legislation would change, and fiscal responsibility would change. Governments wouldn't be so eager to spend, knowing there are checks and balances to their spending. In Alden's view, the transparency of Bitcoin and the scarcity of Bitcoin, if adopted at a large scale, can be the great equalizer for the people. Let's listen to what Lynn Alden has to say.
You kind of have to go back to, the 1800s or earlier, that kind of era, to see how they handled that kind of situation. Because a lot of transactions were just private bearer asset transactions. You give someone a silver coin, you get your bread, right? Or even if you're just handling banknotes that are redeemable for those metals, and so that creates a problem. And that's why you didn't really see a lot of income taxes formalized back then. It's just the administrative overhead was complex, and the ability to hide things was very easy. And so instead you put taxes on. You always have to put taxes on things that you have a very high degree of transparency into. And so that'd be things like property, right? Property is very transparent, physical property. You could also tax big things at the point of entry. So import taxes, export taxes. You can also tax retail establishments, basically businesses, that have a presence and they have a formal accounting, and so it's easy to look into their books. You can tax certain things that, like, alcohol or tobacco or things like that. And so that's how governments used to get a lot of their tax revenue. But in this era of fiat banking and more transparency of incomes, you've had, now in most countries, the income tax is often the biggest line item where they get, and especially when you add income tax with, say, payroll taxes, all the different types of income taxes together that are tied to income, usually it's the vast majority of taxation, and it is hard to maintain that if you had overall better privacy as a widespread usage. But I think that's something that we don't see this decade. I think that's something that if you look at the long arc of time, that's something that we have to consider, with the rise of just, encryption and money, right? So if you have Bitcoin, and especially if you have Lightning or, just various ways to make that naturally more transparent, and if those are widely done, it just changes how the government has to get revenue, just out of necessity. I mean, right now it is clear that, governments don't like privacy. They usually wrap it in terms of either drug trade or terrorist financing, and of course, on the margins, those are problems that law enforcement should be looking into. But the problem is where they say, okay, because these things exist in the margins, nobody's entitled to privacy anymore. That's where they would get pushback, and that's where there's these debates where, some people will say, we have to stamp out 100% of X, Y, Z, and therefore all citizens have to give up certain rights of expectation around privacy. Obviously, I would take a different approach. I would agree with the other side that says, no, go after people that commit a crime, but we're not going to go back and claw back privacy and rights for all people to catch, the 1% of people that are using that privacy in a very deleterious way. And so I do think that's going to be a big battleground kind of for the foreseeable future, for the next decade or so, right? So, I mean, most governments are now threatened by you holding Bitcoin in some sort of custodial environment that they can easily just, control and surveil. But the idea of self-custodying money using privacy techniques and moving around, that threatens their revenue model. And then, they'll often phrase it as terrorist concerns and drug concerns and things like that, which I think some of them are, say legitimately concerned about. But I think that overall it just kind of threatens their general ability for seigniorage and transparent taxation. If everybody holds cash and the government runs a deficit, which most governments do most years, they run some degree of a deficit. And what happens is they essentially print the difference, or they have their central bank print the difference. And so what they're doing is they're contributing to the growth of money supply in the broad sense. In addition to bank lending being a big driver of overall nominal money supply growth. And what that does is it says, okay, everybody's paying, XYZ tax. Let's say everybody's paying a 20% income tax. Here's the government revenue. Here's the government expenses. The government's expenses exceed that. And so instead, you're paying a hidden tax because your cash holdings are getting diluted. And most people are not. They might vaguely be aware of it, but they don't know how to measure that necessarily. Like, what does that mean? What is the equivalent tax rate of that level of inflation happening? And not just inflation relative to zero, but inflation relative to deflation, right? Because if you had like back in the 1800s, United States, for example, deflation was the norm, which you'd expect to be the case. It's kind of like how, in modern terms, TVs get cheaper most years. Phones get either stay the same or get cheaper, but either way, they're getting cheaper per unit of quality, right? So, even if $1,000 TV today is the equivalent of like a $10,000 TV from like 5-10 years ago. And if you get like a kind of almost like an apples to apples TV, it's way cheaper today. That's technology deflation in many cases. Same thing like if you measure the price of wheat in gold, it's generally trended down over the past century because we have better technology for, say, harvesting wheat. Whether it's healthy is another matter, but we can get more calories out of the ground per a gold equivalent because we have better technology to do it. And so actually the baseline we should be measuring inflation from is generally some low negative number, which changes based on productivity growth over time. And so, your savings should be going up by maybe 1 or 2% per year in terms of their buying power on average, roughly speaking. But instead, if they're going down by 5% or 7% a year, for buying high quality scarce goods like high quality real estate and things like that, then you're essentially being diluted in a way that's hard for you to measure. And the other side of that dilution is the government. And the way that I framed it before is that, in a more honest system, to some extent it would mean a smaller government, but it would also mean a more transparent government in the sense that to the extent that they want to pay for something, they have to tax something. Like, let's say the United States wanted to invade Iraq, like they did 20 years ago. And you poll people and you say, should we do it? And everyone's like, yeah, go get them. And they say, okay, well, we're going to have to do a 5% income war tax. Are you still in favor of it? Well, suddenly, like, some percentage of those hands are going to go down, right? People are like, I have to pay for this? No. But it's like, of course, we had to pay for it. Someone had to pay for it. It wasn't free. And it was paid through higher debt and currency dilution. And so in a harder money environment where people are taking their, if enough people take their money out of banks and out of that currency in general, out of, assets denominated in that currency, whether it's banks, whether it's T-bills, things like that, and if they're hoarding Bitcoin or gold or whatever the case may be, or, if we're talking about another country and they're instead hoarding dollars, for example, they're not holding their, I don't know, Indian rupees, and they're instead holding dollars, whatever they're not holding, that's basically, it allows that currency to depreciate faster, which kind of pressures the government ability to kind of keep printing at the rate they have been. And so that's kind of how that plays out long term, in the sense that if this network is successful and if it's more widely held and if people generally prefer that over holding cash, it does constrain government's ability to do things specifically things that are not popular among the public. So if something's still popular, let's say you have a country like Sweden and they want, certain types of healthcare, right? And say 80% of them want it, the government can still do that because they say, okay, everyone's going to pay this tax, and everyone's going to get this benefit, and if Swedes are happy with that, then it works. The things that don't work are things that when you poll people and say, would you pay a tax for this? If they have trouble comfortably getting over and maintaining 50%, those are the types of programs in that country that are unlikely to survive in that kind of harder money, more transparent, honest environment.
To watch the full interview, check out the link in the description.
All right, Alchemist. Thanks for coming back into the cipher. Staying in the know.